All right, so today we're going to really take a deep dive into behavior-driven development,
Okay.
or BDD as it's known.
Right.
And we're going to build upon what we already know about test-driven development to really get a grasp of how these two methodologies kind of work together.
Yeah.
So for those of you who are listening who already know TDD, we're going to take that to the next level and see how BDD sort of enhances it.
Yeah. BDD really kind of takes it to that next level in terms of focusing on the behavior of the application and ensuring that all stakeholders are on the same page.
So it's sort of like a bridge between the technical and the non-technical?
Yeah, it is a bridge.
Right. Okay.
You can think of it that way because it really helps to bridge the gap between, the developers who are writing the code and the business people who are defining the requirements.
The users.
And the users, absolutely.
Yeah.
And they do that by using a shared language.
Yeah.
And the language they use is this given when then structure, which is very human readable. It's very easy to understand.
So this is something that everybody can get behind, even if they don't have a technical background.
Exactly. And it's actually based on the way we think naturally. In everyday life, we often think in terms of, given this situation, when I do this, then this should happen.
Right. So this very natural way to think about things.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's talk about how that given when then structure actually plays out in building software.
So let's take a simple example of a login feature for a web application.
Right.
So in BDD, you would start by defining the behavior of that login feature using the given when then structure.
Okay.
So for example, you might say, given I'm on the login page, when I enter valid credentials, then I should be redirected to the dashboard.
Okay.
So you see how that clearly defines the behavior that we expect from that login feature?
Yeah, it's like writing a user story almost.
It is similar to a user story, but it's more structured.
Right, okay.
And it's more focused on the actual behavior of the system.
And this statement can then be used to write automated tests.
Exactly.
Okay.
So the developers can then take that statement and write an automated test so it'll actually verify that the system behaves as expected.
So it's like a blueprint.
It is like a blueprint.
It's a shared understanding that everybody can work from.
Yeah. And that shared understanding is what makes BDD so powerful, because it helps to avoid misunderstandings and it ensures that everyone is working towards the same goal.
Okay, so we've talked about BDD. We've talked about given when then. What are some of the benefits of using this methodology?
Well, there are many benefits.
Okay.
One of the biggest benefits is improved collaboration because everyone understands the desired behavior up front.
Right.
It leads to much smoother communication between the developers, the testers, and the business stakeholders.
Right.
And that can really help to speed up the development process.
So fewer of those back and forth emails and misunderstandings.
Exactly. And that can save a lot of time and money.
Right.
Another benefit is that the tests themselves are much more readable.
Okay.
Remember that TDD example we saw earlier? That was full of code?
Yeah, and I had to really sort of rack my brain to remember what it all meant.
Yeah. Well, with BDD, the tests are written in plain language, so they're easy for anyone to understand.
Okay.
So even non-technical stakeholders can look at the tests and see what's being tested and how it's being tested.
So it's almost like democratizing testing.
You could say that, yes.
Everyone can participate.
Exactly.
Okay, great. Well, I think that's a good overview of sort of what BDD is. Now let's talk about how BDD actually differs from TDD.
All right, so while TDD focuses on testing individual units of code, BDD takes a more holistic approach and focuses on the behavior of the application as a whole.
Okay.
So you can think of TDD as testing the individual parts of a car, like the engine, the brakes, the transmission, while BDD is more like taking the car for a test drive. Okay.
And making sure that it drives smoothly and gets you where you need to go.
Yeah, I like that analogy.
Good analogy.
So with TDD, you're making sure that each individual part works.
Right.
But with BDD, you're making sure that the whole thing works together.
Exactly.
Okay. So to really highlight the differences between TDD and BDD, let's look at this table that we have here.
Yeah, this table really lays out the key distinctions between the two approaches.
Yeah.
So for example, in terms of focus, TDD is all about the code implementation.
Okay.
While BDD is more concerned with the user behavior and the business logic.
Right. And the language used is also different.
Yeah, absolutely. TDD relies on code-based unit tests.
Right.
Which can be difficult for non-programmers to understand.
Yeah.
But BDD uses this given when then structure that we talked about.
Right.
Which is much more human readable.
And this difference in language really affects who can be involved in the process.
Exactly. With TDD, it's mostly just developers who are involved in writing the tests.
Yeah. But with BDD, testers and product owners can also contribute to defining how the software should behave.
Right.
And this table also gives us a good example to illustrate this difference.
Okay.
So a TDD test might look something like this.
Right.
Assert is 7.4 exceeds true.
Yeah, I remember that one.
But a BDD test for the same functionality would be expressed as, given a number is 4, when I check if it's even, then it should return true.
Right, and that makes so much more sense, even to me as someone who doesn't necessarily read code every day.
Yeah, it's much clearer and more concise.
Right, and so BDD is really about bringing everyone to the table and using a shared language.
Yes.
To define how the software should behave.
Exactly, and that shared understanding is what leads to better software.
Okay, so we've talked about the what and the why of BDD. Now let's get into the how.
Okay.
Can you give me the example of how BDD is actually used in practice?
Sure. Let's go back to that user login feature we talked about earlier.
Okay.
Imagine you're building this feature from scratch, and you want to apply BDD principles. Okay. The first step is to define the behavior using that given when then structure.
Right.
And we formally write that out using what's called Gherkin syntax.
Okay.
So for our login feature, it might look something like this. Feature, user login, scenario, successful login, given I am on the login page.
Right.
When I enter valid credentials, then I should be redirected to the dashboard.
Okay, so now we've got this scenario written out in plain language.
Yeah.
What happens next?
Well, the next step is to take that description and translate it into an automated test.
Okay.
So the developers will write code that will actually simulate a user going to the login page, entering their credentials, and then verifying that they are redirected to the dashboard.
So it's like we're taking that human-readable scenario.
Yes.
And we're turning it into something that a computer can actually execute.
Exactly.
And there are tools that can help with this process, right?
Oh, absolutely. There are lots of tools available. For example, Selenium is a popular tool for testing user interfaces, and Rest Assured is a great tool for testing APIs.
So we've got tools for writing the scenarios, tools for automating the tests. What are some of the benefits of actually going through this whole process?
Well, one of the biggest benefits is that it ensures that everyone is on the same page from the very beginning.
Okay.
The business folks understand what to expect, the developers know what to build, and the testers know exactly what to test.
It's like we're all speaking the same language now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that shared understanding leads to all sorts of good things, like reduced misunderstandings, fewer bugs, and faster development times.
So it's really a win-win for everyone.
Absolutely.
Okay. So we've seen how BDD works in practice. Now I'm curious to know how it compares to TDD.
Okay.
We've touched on some of the differences, but I'd like to delve a little deeper.
Sure.
Okay. So we've established that BDD isn't like replacing TDD. It's more like enhancing it.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
But you mentioned that BDD brings some extra benefits to the table.
Right.
What would those be?
Well, one of the most significant benefits is improved collaboration. When everyone understands the desired behavior up front, thanks to that clear given when then language, it fosters a much more collaborative environment.
Right, through misunderstandings.
Exactly, and that leads to less back and forth communication, fewer errors, and a much smoother development process overall.
Now, you mentioned that the tests themselves are more readable. Can you expand on that a little?
Sure. So remember that TDD example we saw earlier? You know, that assert is 4 equals true?
Oh, yeah, that was a tough one.
That's pretty hard to decipher if you're not a programmer.
I mean, I had to think about it for a second.
Yeah, exactly. But with BDD, the tests are written in plain language using that given when then structure. So even non-technical stakeholders can look at a test and understand what's being tested.
Okay, so it's like you're making testing more accessible to everyone. Okay, so we've got improved collaboration. We've got more readable tests. Are there any other benefits we should know about?
Oh, yeah, there are a couple more.
All right.
So BDD also encourages the reuse of test steps. For example, you can define a step like, given I am on the login page once, and then reuse that step across multiple scenarios.
Right.
So you don't have to write the same code over and over again.
So it's kind of like building a library of reusable components.
It is very much like that, and that can save you a lot of time and effort in the long run.
Okay, so that's a big plus.
Yeah. And then finally, BDD can lead to enhanced test coverage.
Okay.
By clearly defining the desired behavior up front, you're less likely to miss important test cases.
So you're forced to think through all the possibilities.
Exactly. And that can help you to create more robust and reliable software.
Now, you did say that every methodology has its challenges.
Mm-hmm.
So what are some of the challenges that teams might run into when they're trying to implement BDD?
Well, one common challenge is overcomplicating scenarios. Sometimes teams get so caught up in the details that their given when-then statements become really long and complex.
Right.
And that can defeat the whole purpose of BDD, which is to create clear and concise tests.
Yeah, if it's too complicated, no one's going to want to read it.
Exactly. So the key is to keep it simple, focus on one action or outcome per step, and make sure that the language is clear and easy to understand.
Okay, keep it simple.
Yeah.
What else?
Another common pitfall is poor collaboration between teams.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes developers end up working in isolation without enough input from the business side or the testers.
Right.
And that can lead to software that technically functions correctly but doesn't actually meet the needs of the users.
Yeah, so you really need to make sure that everyone's on the same page throughout the entire process.
Exactly. And the best way to do that is to hold regular BDD collaboration meetings where everyone can come together and discuss the scenarios and make sure that they're all aligned.
So those meetings are really key.
Absolutely.
Okay, any other challenges we should be aware of?
Yeah. One more that I often see is slow test execution.
Okay.
This is particularly an issue with UI-based tests, which can take a long time to run,
Right.
especially as your project grows and you have more and more tests to execute.
So how do you deal with that?
Well, one way to speed things up is to use API-based tests whenever possible.
Okay.
These tests bypass the user interface and directly interact with the underlying application programming interface.
So they're faster.
Yeah, they're much faster because they don't have to wait for all the visual elements to load and render.
So that's a good tip.
Yeah, definitely if you can use API-based tests, it can really help to keep your test suite running smoothly.
Okay, so we've talked about the benefits, we've talked about the challenges. Now, I'm really curious about the tools.
Definitely.
What kind of tools are out there to help teams actually implement BDD effectively?
Well, there's a whole ecosystem of tools specifically designed for BDD.
Okay.
And the ones you choose will really depend on the specific needs of your project and the technologies you're using.
So let's say I'm looking for a tool to help me write those given when then scenarios.
Okay, well, for that you have several options.
Mhm.
Cucumber is a popular choice for Java and Ruby projects.
Okay.
Behave is great if you're working with Python. And SpecFlow is a solid option for .NET developers.
So those tools help us create those human-readable scenarios.
Exactly.
What about actually automating the tests themselves?
Well, for that, you can use tools like Selenium for UI testing.
Okay.
And Rest Assured for API testing.
So we've got tools for writing scenarios,
Mhm.
tools for automating tests. Anything else we should be thinking about?
Yeah, don't forget about continuous integration or CI.
Right.
Tools like Jenkins and GitHub Actions can help you integrate your BDD tests into your CI/CD pipeline. Okay, so they run automatically every time you make a change to the code.
So that's how we make sure that our tests are constantly being run.
Exactly.
Okay, this is all starting to make sense now.
Glad to hear it.
So we've covered a lot of ground today.
Yeah.
We've talked about what BDD is, how it works, the benefits, the challenges, the tools.
Right.
Now, curious to know how BDD can be applied outside the realm of software development.
That's an interesting question.
Yeah, you mentioned that earlier, and I wanted to circle back to it.
Yeah, so while BDD is primarily used in software development, the underlying principles can actually be applied to any area of life where you're trying to achieve a specific goal.
Okay.
So, for example, let's say you're trying to learn a new language.
Okay.
You could use the given, when, then framework to break down that goal into smaller, more manageable steps.
Okay, so how would that work?
Well, you might say something like, given I want to learn Spanish,
Okay.
when I study for 30 minutes each day,
Right.
and I attend a weekly language exchange,
Okay.
then I should be able to hold a basic conversation after 3 months.
So it's like you're creating a roadmap for yourself.
Exactly.
And the same approach could be used for team projects as well.
Absolutely.
So BDD is not just for software developers, it's for everyone.
That's right. Anyone who wants to achieve a goal can benefit from using these principles.
I'm sold.
Good.
I'm ready to start applying BDD to my life.
Well, I'm glad to hear that.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought-provoking question.
Okay.
We've talked about the importance of clear communication and shared understanding in achieving goals.
Right.
But what role does creativity play in all of this? Can BDD actually help us to be more creative?
That's a great question, and one that we'll explore in our next episode.
So that's a really interesting question.
Sure.
I mean, BDD sounds kind of like it has a lot of structure and rules.
Mm-hmm.
Could that actually, stifle creativity?
Well, I actually think it's the opposite.
Okay.
BDD can actually enhance creativity.
How so?
Because by providing a clear framework
Okay.
and a shared understanding of the goals, it actually frees up mental space for people to explore different paths and solutions.
So it's like you're not getting bogged down in all the details. You can actually focus on the creative part.
Yeah, you can focus on the how
Right. Oh,
instead of the what.
yeah, that makes sense.
It's like, imagine if someone asked you to just paint something beautiful.
Okay.
That's pretty open-ended, right?
Yeah, that's intimidating.
Yeah, it can be. But if someone said to you, paint a landscape with a mountain range in the background and a river flowing through a meadow in the foreground,
Okay.
now you have a starting point.
Right.
You have some structure to guide your creativity.
So the constraints actually help.
Yeah, in a way they do.
Okay, so BDD sets the stage, but it doesn't, dictate the entire performance.
Exactly.
Okay, I like that. So for our listeners out there who are thinking, okay, this sounds great, but how do I actually start using BDD?
Mm-hmm.
What advice would you give?
Well, I would say start small.
Okay.
You don't have to try to implement BDD for everything all at once.
Right.
Just pick one goal or project
Okay.
where you think BDD could be helpful.
So maybe like a personal goal or something.
Yeah, like finally cleaning out that closet.
Right.
Or maybe a work project that's been kind of
Yeah.
struggling.
Yeah, a project where there's been a lot of miscommunication.
Okay.
And then just try applying the given when then framework.
Okay.
Think about what you want to achieve. That's then.
Right.
What are the steps you need to take to get there? That's the when. And what's the starting point? The given.
So it's like creating a mini BDD scenario.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I can do that. And then as you get more comfortable,
Right.
you can start looking into those more advanced BDD tools.
Yeah. The tools are out there, but the most important thing is to understand the principles
Gotcha.
and to start using them in a way that works for you.
This has been a really eye-opening deep dive into BDD.
Glad you enjoyed it.
I'm walking away with a lot to think about, and I'm excited to start experimenting with these ideas in my own life.
Well, I encourage you to do so and let us know how it goes.
I will. And for our listeners out there, thanks for joining us on this journey into the world of behavior-driven development.
It's been a pleasure. We hope you found it as insightful as we did, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.